So I have no idea what number solidarity session we're up to, but here we all are.
32.
32, so it's a few. Just quick housekeeping. If you can, keep your camera on because it's nice to see everyone do, but we understand you may be indisposed or have terrible reception. So do whatever works for you. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm joining you all from the unceded lands of the Jara and pay my respects to elders past and present, and also to any other First Peoples who are here with us tonight. And I invite all of you to put in the chat whose land you are joining us from. And we'll talk more actually about that as we talk about what's going on with AFSA and agroecology and food sovereignty in the movement. So we thought, since many of you weren't able to, actually, also I should just say, Jess is recording, as you will have just seen. And that's because we do make all of these public. So we put them on our YouTube channel, and you can go back and watch the last 3.5 years worth of them if you wanted to. It's always weird to see my lounge room on the screen. Hi, Josh. Hi, Martin. What was I going to say about, I had one other housekeeping and now it's gone. Anyway, I'll just say what we're going to do tonight. Very unusually for a solidarity session, I'm going to do like a heap of talking because it's a report back from Convergence, and it's also something we've been wanting to do more of, which is for a better political formation of our movements around agroecology in particular. A lot of people ask us, what really is agroecology? Do we need another word for these things? That sort of, those are the sort of questions. So we thought we'd give a really good overview of what agroecology is. And why we're quite wedded to being to promoting agroecology. So first, I'm going to start with the Convergence feedback, and then we'll take a round of questions or input in case anybody says that we're on the wrong track with what happened at Convergence. But I'll start by saying we met up at Brinja-Yuin Country up on the beautiful south coast of what's now New South Wales, and I actually don't know how many people we had. That might be a Jess question. It was a lovely group of maybe 50 people who met for 2 days. And we had the launch of Eating Democracy. We had a bookless launch because the books didn't arrive in time. So thankfully, everybody's kind because it was awkward to launch a book without a book. The books have now arrived, and Jess is madly posting them out to everybody who supported the campaign and has ordered a book already. There's still obviously plenty available for sale if you want. Costa came and joined. We had I think we had 7 of the 11 authors there, and they shared their rich experiences of and struggles of feeding themselves in food sovereign ways, in everything from like remote Alice Springs or up in far north Queensland, down through to urban Melbourne and community garden sort of stuff is in the book. There's people of higher income and lower income and different cultural backgrounds. It's a really wonderful book, and I recommend it to everybody. Following on from Farming Democracy, our first book, arguably our second book. It's a debatable point. So then after the launch, we sort of got stuck into the business of Convergence. And the way I've thought of how to, the declaration is available on the website if you'd like to have a read of the entire declaration. But I've broken it down for the purposes of this to kind of 3 key areas for action in the coming year. One is about strengthening relations, because it's even in our constitution that we value relations over transactions. And so we're always thinking about how to strengthen our relations with each other and with country rather than transacting more, moving away from transactions. The second part is strengthening our support, and including through various means of reparations. And I'll talk about that in a second. And then the final one is strengthening advocacy. In terms of the strengthening relations, we agreed to identify and support existing local collectives. So we know there are many. For example, we already support the grains community. Simon's here tonight, actually. There might be others here from the grains community. We've been supporting that for a couple of years now. For the annual gathering of the grains is the movement of localizing grains economies in Australia and New Zealand. And so we provide basically event support to that. And also they have a channel on Slack if they want to do some organizing. And then we connect them to the broader kind of anti-capitalist decolonial movements to keep furthering their struggle to localize the grains economy. We see an emergence of meat collectives because of the loss of abattoirs and boning rooms across the country, particularly abattoirs. And so we're trying to help them identify each other and learn from each other. We want to establish a Share Your Blueprint project on the website, because some of us have already started doing that, like my own farm where we're building an abattoir. We've already put all of our plans and things on our website. And AFSA would like to make something incredibly visible so people could find it easily and go, oh, well, I have things that I could share, whether it's a development application or plans, literal plans, to put them up, or others who are looking for such things can more readily find them. Other kind of collectives that emerged as possibilities are Pollinators Collective. There were some beekeepers there who are quite interested in collectivizing the beekeepers. And Indigenous peoples are already collectivized, and some are thinking of attaching themselves more to AFSA's work as well and providing kind of input from their perspective. Youth is identifying as a collective that needs to have its own space and voice. We actually have quite a lot of youth members, but the idea of serving particularly the urban youth, like university students and things, and helping them work out what food sovereignty looks like on university campuses. And then urban farming was another one identified. The idea of the collectives is not that AFSA as a national organization would establish collectives. What we're very aware of from our 12 years of existence and from 3.5 years of my PhD and reading all the literature on these things, is the way that local collectives form through relations, and then we can help with connecting them to others that might be able to help them in their struggles through networking and not reinventing every wheel. But where there are people coming to us individually and not part of a collective, we can help them with support to start one in their local area, but not going in and kind of skyhooking into a place. And then that actually brings us to thinking about common languages. And I'm going to talk about more of that when I talk about agroecology more broadly. But the common language to help collectives help each other and help themselves and help each other, we think is really important. And that's why we said, for example, it'd be great if all the meat collectives just called themselves like ours we're calling is Meat Collective at Jonai. And then there could be, it doesn't have to be at a farm. It could be Meat Collective at Bundara. I don't know. It could be different places. But if they're all meat collectives, then people go, oh, there's a whole network of these collectives that I should know about. So we're thinking about where is it useful to have the common language like that, and where is it not only not useful, but actually counterproductive, because many collectives will emerge with their own identities that have no reason to be identifiable in that same way. When you don't have something like a national struggle for loss of abattoirs, it's something else. So wanting to really keep thinking through, where does that shared language matter more, and where does it matter less? The People's Food Plan also does some of that work, which I'll talk about in a minute. Then in the last strengthening of relations, we talked about the Agrarian Trust, which has emerged as a body of work that AFSA is delighted to be hosting. It's actually a couple of lawyers who are really driving it as a pro bono effort on their parts. And we're fortunate to be in discussion with them and with other people who are experts in the problems of fair housing. And what community land trust knowledge could bring to an agrarian trust. So very early conversations, they're talking with Trust for Nature about putting farm covenants onto properties to protect them, to protect farmland, talking about how to support succession planning to access land as people give up their land so it doesn't just go to developers, talking about lots of different ways an agrarian trust could perhaps support more people onto land, and also support land back or land sharing with First Peoples in for reconstituting kind of Indigenous sovereignty on their own lands, and what that looks like. And that then leads us into a policy space too. Obviously, there's advocacy around all of this. The next bit we talked about really was, the last part, sorry, I should say the last part of collectives for us is the international collectives that we're part of already. You know, we're members of La Via Campesina. 2 of our national committee members are in the air right now on the way to Colombia for the 8th International Conference to be with all of the comrades from across the world. They're very excited to be there representing AFSA, and what we've been talking about a lot is the enormous amount the organization has learned from our interaction in the international spaces. Like I would say a strong part of why AFSA has such a consistent decolonial, anti-capitalist, anti-patriarchal position is because of our engagement with the international movement. It's, you know, it's fierce, it's fearless, and it doesn't hedge on whether something should be in a market or should be, you know, in the control of the peasants. It's a very serious movement that we're delighted to be part of. We're also members of the International Planning Committee for Food Sovereignty, which is what takes us to most of the UN meetings that we attend, which took us to COP15, the biodiversity COP last year, and saw agroecology actually enshrined in Target 10 of the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. We're also members of the Civil Society and Indigenous Peoples Mechanism, which articulates the World Committee on Food Security. I'm trying not to say these in acronyms and give them to you as titles. How am I going? And then Urgency, the International Network for Community-Supported Agriculture. So we're quite active in all of those groups. And something we always like to say to our members is we don't pay, none of our funding that comes from membership supports our international work. The international organizations themselves or the UN supports that work. So we don't take domestic money into the international field, even though the international work informs what we're doing back home quite heavily. In terms of strengthening support and reparations, we agreed that we will have a pay the rent campaign this coming year. We've been advocating pay the rent for quite a long time, but we want to actually run a campaign probably in solidarity with other allies who would like to do a similar thing. In that regard, we also will advocate for a universal basic income, again, in allyship with other organizations who also want to advocate for a UBI. We reckon a UBI is probably the most obvious and straightforward systemic transformation you could have for right to food in Australia. And you'll see a lot more coming from us on that future campaign, like why we think that's the case and why we think it's a viable option in Australia. Bursaries for agroecology internships. We have quite a few younger farmers who come into the food sovereignty movement by doing internships on small farms like ours. And we know that not everyone can afford to do unpaid internships, but we also know that smallholders can't afford to pay people for internships. And there are various feelings about those sorts of exchanges anyway, and whether it should be financial. And again, being more relational than transactional, we have, you know, a lot of interesting views on the topic. However, to acknowledge the fact that not everyone could afford to just take 1 to 3 months to go do an internship, we've agreed to establish bursaries for some of those. It'll be a very modest sum in the beginning, but something to help people be able to make that choice where they wouldn't have had it otherwise. We will continue to support the growth of what we consider the intrinsic infrastructure of agroecology, whether that be abattoirs or grain mills. And we're really interested, again, like I said, so there's the sharing of knowledge, which is key to agroecology and food sovereignty, horizontal knowledge sharing. So sharing blueprints, sharing development plans, sharing food safety plans, making those things widely available to our members and beyond. But there's also then the next question around funding, and I'll come back to that in a minute as well. How do we build these things? And it's like one of those central and really difficult and complex questions when you're trying to rebuild a system that has been mostly lost to us in terms of localized food systems economies. And then finally, there's the legal guide for our support. And it still isn't actually launched because we got so caught up with the People's Food Plan and the Eating Democracy finalization. We just haven't finished it. It's not in a state quite fit for the public. So I would anticipate early in the new year. We received some funding from Sustainable Table to help us complete that. And we really look forward to doing that in the new year. And then the last bit I wanted to say about what we said we'd do for next year is strengthening advocacy. So we've launched the People's Food Plan. it's not final because it never will be, is our view. Right now, it's still up there as a basically an embedded PDF, I think, on the website. So it's like horrendously unsearchable, really. But we also have a plan very soon to start putting it on the website in ways that you can go through hyperlinks and just grab parts of it for advocacy that's very specific to certain groups. Like, for example, I spent this morning in a biosecurity strategy launch for Victoria, and I kept wanting to be able to just send them the biodiversity is biosecurity section, because I couldn't even get any of them to say biodiversity, let alone believe that it's part of biosecurity. So it would have been great to have been able to send them that part of the document. I sent them the whole thing instead. I wonder if they'll get to it in the 200 pages, but anyway, see how that goes. And then part of that, getting the People's Food Plan out there and working out lobbying plans from various local groups or from AFSA is the creation of state liaisons. And we are delighted to say we've had, I think it's like 2 people per state put their hands up to act as state liaisons. And they're co-designing the roles with the National Committee. The 2 key parts of it we see are supporting members in the states, so that there's somebody in that state and understands its context, and can connect them to others in their state. And then the other is interfacing with government. We need people who understand the policy context in each state and who can turn up for meetings with ministers, like I've been doing in Victoria for so long. But if we have to go to ones with me in Victoria, for example, going to Sydney for the inquiries is fossil fuels and not a great use. It's better if it's somebody in New South Wales. So we're pretty excited about the state liaisons emerging as an advocacy tool. That is the brain dump of what we agreed to do for the coming year. Now I'm going to take any question and territories, Amy. Yes, but we do have people put their hand up for ACT, but not yet for the Northern Territory. So we have had people volunteer for everywhere except the Northern Territory. Actually, I don't think we have Tasmania yet either. So we will. And because Tasmania has plenty of people, I don't think there's going to be any trouble there. It's just an outreach question. So any questions about the 2024 plan before I move on to some context setting for agroecology? Someone else should definitely talk. It will make everybody happier. No, literally no. Do you think it's a good plan for 2024? How about if I ask you that? Great. Ambitious as usual. Okay, well, I'm going to actually share my screen then and show you. I've got some slides to speak to as we talk about agroecology. We just think it's a terribly important conversation, and we want to keep having it in really open ways going forward. So if I can remember how to share screen, I think I can. Yes, you can see that, can't you? Yes, I'm just going to go. I'm going to start. I like to start talking about agroecology by talking about relations. And here on our farm, we're on Brinja-Yuin Country. And when we were welcomed to country by Beck Phillips, she talked to us about how if you drink from the Loddon River, you are 60% Loddon River. And so you're kin with that river. And that made our community think more about what water are we drinking? We drink rainwater from the tanks here. So our rain is seeded in Gunditjmara and Nurrinjeri country. And so we feel that we're connected to the countries where that rain comes from. But also what's interesting is that we're a watershed for Nurrinjeri country, not for Gunditjmara. So our water goes back there. And thinking that through really helped us think about the full cycle. We believe, obviously, in making things healthy, but that way of thinking about country and its connection to other countries made us think more deeply about our relations and our responsibility to send the water back healthy where it also actually comes from. And in our case, Josh, who's here with us tonight, is actually a proud Nurrinjeri man. And so we feel like there's a for him, there's obviously an even deeper connection, but there's a responsibility to send things back, send water back clean, to nurture his people. And that makes us think also about, you know, a kind of anonymous food systems. And if you're eating food from McDonald's, I mean, does that make you, I don't know, does that make you part of Northern Territory beef? I don't know what it makes you, but I feel like it doesn't make you connected to much. And so that's pretty core, obviously, to food sovereignty and agroecology movements. The other thing I like to do when I'm talking about agroecology is make it very clear who we are in Australia compared with the majority world. So we call ourselves, or others call us, the global north, and then there's the global south, and this broadly shows what that is. The better term for it that I've learned in the last 5 years is minority world and majority world. I like it better because it explains to how small we are, how insignificant we are in numbers, but how significant we are in impact. And 80% of the world's resources are used by 20% of the world's population. And on the contrary, 70% of the world's food is produced by smallholders, and they're mostly in the global south. So we've taken on the movement of agroecology very much from our exposure to that international movement, and through spending time with the world's peasants and learning really the deeper politics and struggles from them. I think we all know what capitalism is. And the main point here is, for me, is that capitalism wants to operate in exchange values rather than use values. It separates the notion of what's useful for what can I get people to pay for it. And we don't want to live in food systems that treat food that way. And so Marx came up with a concept of the metabolic rift, which probably some of you here would be familiar with, but it's this separation of humans from land, or people from land, and labor is the thing that actually mitigates our relationship with land. And by alienating us from our labor, the proletarianization of society, sending more people to cities to be wage slaves, as I'm sure you've also heard, alienates them from their labor and from land. And that creates this metabolic rift whereby the fertility of the countryside is sent to become literally shit and waste in the cities. And that, instead of continuing the fertility loop that it would have had historically, that's like fundamentally what agroecology wants to mend, is the metabolic rift. Oops, why doesn't it want me to? I must have pressed something else. So the food sovereignty movement arose in 1996 when peasants from across the global north and the global south actually got together to fight against the rise of the World Trade Organization, which was had started the Common Agricultural Policy in Europe, and that was starting to interfere through, exports of mostly dumping, basically, of surplus in the global south, which was destroying smallholders' capacity to feed themselves. Like now we have, for example, our comrades in Indonesia or Japan tell us stories about the liberalization of trade that has meant that now they get cheap rice dumped into their countries, where they were self-sufficient in rice, forever. And now they aren't, because they can't compete with the cheaper rice that's imported. That's what started the food sovereignty movement in 96. And now there's a saying, food sovereignty without agroecology is just policy, and agroecology without food sovereignty is just technology. So the struggle is about policy. It's about fighting government policies that are supporting the neoliberal capitalist corporations that are owning more and more of our food systems. Whereas agroecology it's actually more than just the technology, but without the food sovereignty aspects, without the social movement, we're not going to actually change the whole world. We're not going to get everyone able to eat, to grow food and eat in the ways that we do. So there have been two Neoleni gatherings, and there's going to be one more in 2025. The first one was in 2007, and that was where the definition of food sovereignty was workshopped, if you like, with a huge group of activists from around the world, peasants from around the world, because there was already an encroaching kind of co-optation of food sovereignty as language by corporate elites and governments. And so the movement got together and said, no, we're going to assert what food sovereignty is, and it's the right of people to nourishing and culturally determined food, and for it to be produced and distributed in ethical and ecologically just and socially just ways, and for our right to participate in the food system. That's what food sovereignty is, and it's not something else. The 2015 Nyaleni gathering, also in Mali, was the redefinition, so it wasn't reclaiming of agroecology, because again, the global north in particular was starting to erode the notion of agroecology. So now you have in Europe, they use the term agroecology quite a lot. And there is a lot of scholarship around what Geraldo and Rossett call fake or junk agroecologies. And basically those agroecologies are what they say fall into either neoliberal, or I forget the other term actually that they use for it, examples of so-called agroecology. So they don't even like using the word agroecology for what is being expressed as that. Those are basically soil health improvement, farming, better farming, but still with inputs, purchased inputs. A lot of knowledge is still kind of purchased. Food is still sold, food or produce is still sold on commodity markets. It's not fundamentally transforming the food system. There's a new Nyaleni process underway, which will meet in India in 2025. And this one is actually intended to bring all of the social movements from around the world together beyond food sovereignty. And that includes our climate comrades and feminists and anti-racism. So trying to make a very intersectional gathering to help everyone understand that food and agriculture systems are actually really crucial to things like the climate movement and also biodiversity and conservation movements. Agriculture is over 50% of the world's arable land. So you can't ignore agriculture if you're talking about climate or biodiversity. So in terms of what agroecology is in kind of being spelled out in principles, there's a million research articles on it. If you ever wanted to look, like there's hundreds and hundreds of articles investigating what agroecology is expressed as and practiced as around the world. But some kind of key points to it for us are, I don't love this infographic. I don't find it super obvious to read, but it's talking about the level is increasing the efficiencies, level 1, increasing the efficiency of inputs, etc. And then you get up to redesigning your agroecosystems, but it's not until you get to level 4, which is those things across social diets and connectivity, that you start reconnecting. We don't say consumers in Australia, we say eaters, and farmers, through the development of alternative food networks. And then level 5, building a whole global food system that's based on participation, localness, fairness, and justice. So when I was in another meeting yesterday that was talking about centering climate justice in food and agriculture policy in Victoria. And when we were asked to speak to that, coming from food sovereignty and agroecology, climate justice is intrinsic to food sovereignty and agroecology. It's very much a nobody left behind approach to transforming the food system, which is why participation is right up there at the top. And land and natural resource governance is also up very high, and fairness, that everybody gets to participate and have access to food and land. I mean, the land one is obviously a big, I don't love this infographic either, but I thought maybe this one would be easier for people to see what it's showing in terms of those moving through the levels of what's transformational and what's incremental. And so why is agroecology, why is it in Europe, why is it becoming kind of co-opted by the, I guess a lot of it's the large scale farming, who don't want to change the economic system because they benefit from it. But others also who can't see that this is possible, Maggie Thatcher's stuff about there is no alternative, that Tina thinking. So that's obviously a result of what Gramsci called hegemony, where the ideas of the powerful come to be seen as the norm, and actually the oppressed become complicit in their own oppression by sort of propping all of these things up. And they're sold as, this is what everyone needs, but they're actually only benefiting a very small proportion of the population. And so just as some examples of that, we're told that Australia is doing so well in terms of feeding the, I was going to say that before. Anyway, we're told that we need all this grain, for example, to feed the world, but actually over 50% of the grain produced here goes to feed and fuel, like livestock feed and fuel. It's not actually feeding humans at all. We're also told there's that narrative about feeding the world, when in fact, the vast majority of our exports go to either middle-class people in middle-class countries or middle-class people in developing countries. So we're literally not feeding the world. And we're doing it with really scarce soil and water resources for the profit of very few people. In the case of cotton, the example I like to cite, Australia has something like 1,500 cotton farmers, and they use 26% of Australia's agricultural water. So what that means is that 0.006% of our population is using 26% of our agricultural water, and they export 99% of the cotton they produce. So I don't see how that's benefiting very many people, arguably just those 1,500 farms, some of which are corporations, but not all. Some are family farms. So in that, there is no alternative, as I said at the start. Yes, but how will the world feed itself? The world does feed itself, actually. And we actually got things got much better for a while, and hunger went down, and poverty actually also declined for a while, though not as much as hunger. But then, as we've seen the creep of neoliberalism in our policy settings across the world since the 80s especially, although 70% of the world is still fed by smallholders, the number of hunger is again rising. So we're back to about 800 billion people in the world are hungry. And in Australia, that's 15% of our population is food insecure, not necessarily the exact same definition as hungry, but 15% in the last year were considered food insecure. So 800 billion are hungry, and 1 billion are overweight or obese. So we have serious problems of over and under consumption, and consumption of ultra-processed foods sold by corporates who are the ones who benefit rather than the people. So I said that I would come back quickly to talk about the question of funding. One of the things about, this is the last slide, one of the things that agroecology is very upfront about as well is that we value labor over capital. And in what that means to us is, instead of taking on a lot of debt, or instead of having bigger tractors, whatever that is, as much as possible, human labor is a desirable thing to use on a farm. It's not an input, it's intrinsic to the farm. And it's an expression of life and livelihood to be working on your own farm. And in our case, and in others, land sharing with others, and all of us working together on farms in negotiations of fairness commensurate with need and capacity. All of this is kind of within a degrowth mentality as well, that you don't need more, you need to understand enoughness. And we talk about frugal abundance and radical sufficiency in the degrowth movement, as well as in agroecology. And I'll just finish by saying there's a wonderful article that we shared recently on emancipatory agroecologies. And we're going to turn that into a simplified kind of, I think, a week-long set of messages to explain what are emancipatory agroecologies. But they give you, it's kind of a heuristic. So there's 7 questions that say, do they question and transform structures instead of reproducing them? Do they cultivate autonomy rather than dependency? So right back to that question of how we fund things. I think that we have a lot of problems with how we fund things, and it's because it's very difficult to rebuild expensive infrastructure that we've lost access to. Do they shape economies based on use value rather than exchange value? So are they relational rather than transactional as well? Do they strengthen organization in terms of collective processes rather than individualized projects? It's like I said, with the collectives, we know there are individual projects going on. That's great. People are getting on with the job. But are they also collectivizing to share those resources and make sure more people are learning from it? Are we building horizontal processes rather than hierarchical ones? Are we building capacity to struggle and transform rather than confirm the hegemonic structures? And finally, are they acting based on culture and spirituality rather than productivism? Like I said, there's a series of questions that go with those, and we're going to communicate them in simpler terms than an academic article in the very near future. Especially now that Jess is back, recently returned from attending the International Treaty on Plant Genetic Resources for Food and Agriculture meetings of the governing body. And so she can help us again, because she does the lion's share of the work in this place. I think that's enough from me. And I suspect now you'll have some questions, I hope, or comments. Ben's here, he can always heckle. Not that he heckles, he just asks good questions.
Well, I'm happy to kick us off, given that you've set me up. And around the 5 steps of incremental transformation stuff, presumably they're not linear steps, like you need to go through 1, 2, up to 4 or 5. Can you talk a little bit to what's the role of jumping kind of straight to 4 or 5 versus do we need people like corporate consultant backgrounds, people like me, helping kind of in the mainstream around step 2 or 3?
Yeah, so I think the problem with the incremental, I think most things take incremental steps, right? I mean, that part, nobody's contesting that we have to, for example, figure out how to build some of this infrastructure to be able to get to transforming food systems. And we need the increments of how we get more farmers farming so that we can feed our local communities with more farmers. So to a certain extent, it's all going to have to be iterative. I think it's, again, it's that political framing. It's the ideology, really, of are we going to stop at that increment? Are we going to think that it's enough because now this community has it, but it's so incremental that they only did it by going into enormous debt. So we're not sure if the system's actually going to function. It might crash. So it's like picking the contextual parts of the increment and going, which ones are non-negotiable? And I really think for the radical transformation that agroecology calls for, avoiding debt is such a fundamental one. The people who are having to go into enormous amounts of debt to access land or to build infrastructure are struggling because they have to pay back interest. They're letting somebody else earn money off having loaned them their bloody money. And so we have to, I mean, it's one of the things that just makes me so cross about rich people. And I'm not sorry if you're one of them who's here, but like people with a lot of money can share so that we can rebuild community infrastructure. There's enough to go around. So you think about actually people without a lot of means often share through food banks and things, like they share what little they have through volunteering and other things. So it's not like enormous sums, but they share. So there's like a major cultural shift to get, God, we learned it in kindergarten, right? You're meant to share.
Can I ask, so much of what you just talked about, but particularly, I guess, the slide on hegemony really refers to things that are happening in the broader society in some really scary ways at the moment, like outside of the food sovereignty movement as well. I'd really love to hear a bit more about how AFSA and some of your international partners are working with, I guess, maybe unlikely allies or organizations in different fields to advance that kind of goal. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think I know what you mean, Simon. So the movement's going through that right now in the Nyaleni process. And we had our first steering group meeting in June in Rome and invited only the deeply politically aligned organizations, like some of the big labor unions and indigenous organizations, the NGOs that actually exist on independent funding streams and have a clearly anti-capitalist ideology. So they're the only ones who've been invited into the steering committee at this stage because of what they see as the danger of eroding the ideology that's going to get us to the transformation, right? But then in terms of those who might come to the Nyaleni gathering itself, there are debates in our movement about how open these things should be, because obviously if you close the tent, then I just read this today, like you're forming a club rather than a movement. So we don't want that, right? We want a movement. So it's like picking the appropriate times. And one of the things we see a lot in the movement is so IPC, the International Planning Committee for Food Sovereignty, when it was founded, it had quite a lot of large NGOs like Oxfam, who were original members, as such as it's a platform rather than an association, but they were members of the platform. By 2013, some of those large NGOs, Oxfam being actually the most glaring one, had become quite controlling of the movement and trying to have control of the narrative of the peasants who were the social movement leaders. And so in their Global Assembly in 2013 in Brasilia, they said, okay, so here's the deal. This is a social movement, not an NGO movement. And we would love you to stay involved and support our voices in getting, so that we can do deeper policy work. You're funded, you can actually do work that we don't have time to do as farmers. So we'd love to see you involved. But if you insist on remaining a member and insist on speaking on behalf of IPC, which, by the way, no organization is meant to do. None of us are meant to say this is IPC. If you insist on doing that, then you can't really hang around. And so Oxfam left, and some of the other large NGOs left, but the ones who shared the same ideology, they stayed, and they're still there today at like Third World Network, Focus on the Global South, ETC Group, GRAIN, FION, those African Center for Biodiversity. They're very strong, small NGOs who are committed to the cause, and they see their role as lifting the voice of the social movements rather than being the voice of the social movements. So if you mean that kind of partnership, in terms of money, nobody wants to take what they consider dirty money. And dirty money is two things, right? One is, where did it come from? As it, literally whose money are we being funded by? But then there's the other thing about what's it going to do to control us. So if we take it, how will it dictate our activities? And so I think the movements across the world more broadly definitely take draw different lines on those questions of where they'll accept money from, and how they'll deal with money that comes in that might have strings. But at the global level, it's very clear that they don't take dirty money, and they don't take money from anything that has has restrictions on what they can say and do. And the AFSA takes the same view. That's actually, we're in the same position.
Might jump in with a very random question. Hi, Tammi. Hi, everyone. It's just so great to hear all of the work that you guys are up to and how broad spectrum it is. It's just fantastic, and as always, in complete admiration. I am finding myself shocked that it's December, which kind of freaks me out for one, but then with that, reflecting upon the year and what's sort of taken place and the outcomes and the main challenges, et cetera, and then trying to learn and evaluate all of that, and then what we need to focus on next year. Just because you guys are working across so many different areas, but all intrinsically driving towards the bigger goal, what have been your main challenges this year? Like, if you could pick three main challenges that have really informed what you're going to do next year. So, for example, for me right now, I'm finding everything's ending up in infrastructure. Like, it's so many infrastructure blockages, and that seems to be a big point because there's so much amazing work happening in other areas. What do you guys sort of see in the work that you're doing at the moment that this year you're like, crap, didn't think that would be so hard, and actually was a real challenge, and of sort of focal points for you guys next year as an organization? Just on a whole, I know it's broad.
Yeah. Well, I think in the movement, it's the same stuff over and over, right? It's land and infrastructure. And globally, that's the case too. Why the right now the IPC is calling for agrarian reform and land tenure global conference to be hosted by the FAO, they hope, because this is everywhere. The land grabbing is in every country. We don't know of anywhere that we're not losing access to land, or prices are just going up for other reasons. So, you've got not only speculators, but you've got lifestylers like I'm dealing with here who don't want us to build an abattoir. So there's a whole bunch of land problems. But then infrastructure, absolutely. And to the extent that now I would say it's hard. It's not any harder, but it's hard because, as I said, I think before you maybe came in, the question of funding these things is the big part of the puzzle that everybody's still working out. But the thing that's making it less hard is here in Victoria, at least, the government's been listening to us for a decade, and they now are calling us, asking how we can help with the project of things like small scale abattoirs, like how can we help with policy changes, because they can see the writing on the wall. They know we're about to lose all the abattoirs, and that once that happens, small scale livestock farmers will cease to exist. So they're looking for fast tracking solutions. So like some things will probably be hard for a lot longer. But anywhere where we have developed good relations with government, it's getting easier. It's improving. Hence, we started the state liaisons coming this year so that we can start those relations getting really serious in the other states as well.
Amazing.
Yeah. And what's the other hardest? I mean, the hardest thing, actually, Georgine, is probably what I spoke about just before too, is it's the hegemony of neoliberalism is actually the hardest. It's getting people to think that there are alternatives, that we don't have to replicate the old system with nicer people. Like it's actually a whole system change that's required. And that's a huge piece of work to do in a country like Australia that is as far down the neoliberal path as we are, But when you read research from Europe where they still have, like I think it's Austria that owns like 60% of the housing and rents it out at low cost to not like just average people. And you hear that and you're like, what? That's happening in other places, or even places like in Latin America, where you've had these terrible turmoil, really mostly because of the interference of America and the CIA. And so you've got the leftist governments were overturned, and these tyrants were put in place, and people were dying regularly for resisting and for trying to maintain access to land. And then you get a leftist government back in power because the popular movements, mobilize. And so we're like, oh, it's so hard to overturn neoliberal policy. And it's like, they overturn dictators over there. Like, we need to really strengthen our game.
That's a good context setter, isn't it?
Yeah, totally. And that's what I mean too about the international work being so important to strengthening our political frameworks and our sense of what's possible, because we're with them and listening to their stories all the time.
Yeah, I agree.
I think there was something in the oh, this is good. Thank you, Raglan Crew. Thanks. Oh, that Alison shared it for Raglan Crew. Actually, and that reminds me, in the People's Food Plan, the updated People's Food Plan, we've got a whole section on like spheres of action for transformation. It comes from some research that talks about the personal, practical, and political, and how they're all deeply interconnected. But they also can have different levels of impact. So if you're choosing to buy free-range eggs, then that might have a really excellent impact on your own sense of well-being and actual well-being. But in terms of systems change, it's not huge. However, if enough people do that, it starts becoming a more political consideration, I guess, as you see, consumer movements, as they call them, starting to have some authority, but that's easily eroded if it's not collectivized. And so turning those into political actions requires the collectivizing, not just the personal actions of a bunch of atomized individuals. So those are all sort of, again, key to the movement building and collectivizing, again, to your question, Georgina, collectivizing in a country that has lost, even really a strong union movement to a large extent, and has been convinced that, there's no point in collectivizing, or it always ends up corrupt. And it's like, what is this alternative that we're existing in? Are we just going to sit here and take this, or are we going to actually look to the fact that collectivizing is working all over the world? The Indians, they collectivized, and they had their movement had protests for a year to combat 3 of the new neoliberal policy changes they were trying to bring in, and they won. They lost like 700 people to attacks and suicide in the process of that year's protest, but they won. And that's why Neil Lenny is going to take place there in 2025. Others? Okay, so you're just all agroecologists now. We've done it. Great. I mean, you probably arrived that way, but
will you be ready to announce the state liaisons sometime soon? It'd be great to know who's who in the zoo.
Absolutely, Amita. We actually, again, I think with Jess away, we all just went, oh no, we don't know how to do anything. So now that Jess is back, we can get onto a couple of things. Like, we've got to have a first meeting with all of them to talk about how they want to start the practice of state liaisons, and then yeah, definitely be announcing who they are and letting people start to connect to them. I know in SA, a couple of them are really keen to get moving and start reaching out to people in the food movement over there who are a bit disconnected from others. And I know in Queensland, they're pretty keen to start talking to ministers, and it's like they're already kind of ready to go. It's the committee itself becomes a bit of a bottleneck if we're all very busy, which is certainly the case for me, due to submit a PhD in 16 days in theory. See how, well, wish me luck. But yes, Amita, I hope we're announcing that really soon.
Awesome, super exciting.
Yeah.
Tammi, I don't have a fully formed question here, so maybe just a rambling thought at the moment. But so, the ACT just released their Canberra region local food strategy draft, and Ruth, I imagine you saw that as well. And I was fairly underwhelmed by it. And I don't know, I just don't think it was very progressive, transformational, whatever we want to call it. Like, how do we encourage them to do more? Do we encourage them to do more? Is that where you put your energy, or do you do all the things on the ground without them?
Ruth could speak probably for a while to that if you want to, Ruth, and you're in a position to, because we were fairly underwhelmed as well, Amy, as you can imagine.
Yeah, there's only so long you can bash your head against a brick wall before the bleeding becomes overwhelming. So we just keep doing. We have stopped. Well, we keep engaging with the process because we have to stay in front of that process, but it's not going anywhere. So we have to just be leaders in what we're doing to transform the food system ourselves. It's not. I don't think it's going to happen by us waiting for policymakers to lend us a hand. Sadly, in the ACT.
No, and there's a lot of research around the problems of enabling policy frameworks and how they're developed, and how hard they are to develop. And one of the things that comes out most clearly in the literature is that where those are being developed without the engagement of social movements, as in farmers on the ground, then you don't get very good outcomes. And so trying to get governments to understand why they need actual farmers in the room for those discussions is one of our challenges in many levels of government. One of the things I learned locally, even though, is that without a local farmers organization, like as in for our shire or something, they still just come and pick you individually, and then you may or may not be the best person to be involved in that policy process. Whereas if you form a local collective, if you had oh, that's amazing. Ben's joining from Colombia, or an airport on the way to Colombia. Yeah, they said to us, if we had a Hepburn Farmers Collective, then they would know to just talk to that collective. And I thought that was really useful to hear that from the EDO. Like, oh, so we'll do that, right? We'll make sure there's an identifiable local collective for you, so you know who to talk to.
Yeah, we're finding that really useful. Well, it's starting to be. We've been doing this. So Southern Harvest has been running now for 12, 13 years. And we're now just starting to find that engagement of being contacted by various departments or even the media saying, we need to talk to a farmer about this issue, or we need to find out more information about how this thing is affecting farmers in this region. And it's a positive thing, but it's taken a long time to get to this point. But now we can actually start to funnel those conversations where they need to go.
Yeah. And I have to say, from all the years of this, I wouldn't put too much of our energy into those kinds of policy development processes, even though AFSA does put a lot of energy into policy development generally. But the impact it comes from the working upstream and downstream, like start with the farmers and then look at the policy frameworks and then try to keep bringing them together as much as you can, but invest a lot of energy in place-based work, not just policy work, to help you maintain your strength for the struggle. Because just policy work can be fairly dispiriting when you see things constantly eroded. You think, oh, it was going well. It's like the Global Biodiversity Framework. I hope I never go to another COP. Watching what started out with some really strong language was eroded down, so that agroecology that gets into Target 10, it sits next to sustainable intensification, because Brazil is just an ingenious negotiator and just whittled people away till at 4 a.m. they gave up and they left it in there. So that's dispiriting. You don't want to be part of that. But I want to also just acknowledge here Paula's comment about partnered project funding, like direct fundraising. Absolutely. And that's certainly on our own farm. Crowdfunding is how we've done that. And that's we've paid people back in meat or workshops. And the abattoir, we're doing a mixed thing of, we're accepting donations from those in the community who would like to support the project, but we're also selling my cookbooks, and we've got another few things up our sleeve. So it's not going to be just donations. It's actually going to also be an exchange where people get something for what they give. The farmers, of course, get an abattoir if we get it built. So I'm hoping to keep funding it slowly through those ways. But that's the other thing. This funding, we can let some of them be slow, but some are actually getting more pressing. There's a very seriously increasing risk to farmers, small scale farmers across this country, having access to basic processing infrastructure. I mean, it happened to grain actually much longer ago, but now abattoirs are just the next one. And yeah, so do we have the capacity to be slow and go at the speed of our bank balances? I'm not sure we do, which has always been our way. But yeah, and fundraising, I like the partnered one, that idea, fundraising with partners. So we've got the restaurant in town that uses some of our meat. They'd like to do a big fundraiser with us. And so that's helpful, right? Because they have a whole other kind of community of people who love what they do at the restaurant. And if they do a fundraiser with us, everyone gets a nice time and we get some more money towards the project. So being creative and not taking on debt is a critical thing for us. Examples of collective fundraising for purchasing land. Only in First Peoples examples that I've seen, Mel. So Naldarin actually raised, Josh, do you remember how much it was? It was like 1.2 million or something. It was quite a lot of money. Does that sound right? Yeah. That was to buy land back, though. I have not seen collective fundraising in that sense of crowdfunding for farmers. I saw one fail years ago. I think because the rewards were like, you can have your name on a bench on the property. It's like, maybe that was the problem. It wasn't the best crowdfunding campaign in the world. So no, but that's why the Agrarian Trust wants to investigate options for whether it's philanthropic money or whether it's fundraising, whether it's finding people who are ready to hand down land from succession planning that they don't need to cash in for a super and that they don't have kids to hand it on to. So just trying to think of lots of ways that land might become available in an affordable or ideally free way to get more farmers or First Peoples back onto it. As we collect stories, as the Agrarian Trust develops, by the way, we will certainly be sharing those. Well, we're at 7:30. Does anyone have any other questions? Well, you made me feel like I can finish this PhD. I said a lot of things I remembered from the article I'm working on. So that's good. I feel like I've told the introduction about 16 times. Now I could write it down. So that's been helpful for me. I hope it has for all of you. Thanks for coming along. Lovely to see so many familiar faces and some new ones. And look forward to working with many of you for a lot longer.
Good luck with the PhD.
Thank you. Very pointy end.